Hey Dev Team, welcome back to Flutter with Drag. Let's continue with our app, and we're going to be sorting out the authentication today to some extent. We're going to create it so that we can log in and log out of the app a little bit more easily than we currently are, and this will set us up for future development, which is very much needed. One of the big problems with app development is the amount of boilerplate that you need to put in at the beginning, and that we're still in this stage of putting more and more stuff in just to make the thing work, but it's essential stuff and it needs to be done. So I've got my server running. I haven't got the app running at the moment, but let's just get a few little tiny bits done. So the first thing is when we start the app, very initially, the app might not know whether we're logged in or not. So we're wanting to display a splash screen. It'll then work out whether we're logged in or not. And if we are logged in, it'll take us to our current pages. And if we're not logged in, it's going to take us to a login page. So we need to just get a few of those set up because they're quick and easy. So in the screens folder, I'm just going to create a new file, which I'm going to call splash.dart, and this is going to be the splash screen. I'm not going to spend much time on this at all today. We'll come back and pretty this up in the future. So splash screen, that is going to extend material, or have material, and in it we're going to have a scaffold, and the scaffold is going to have a body for now, which is just going to be a center with the text of the child saying this is the splash screen. And that's it. That's all we need. I'm going to copy that build method and come out of there. And in the screens folder, I'm going to create a new file called signin.dart. And again, this is going to be a stateless widget, sign in screen. We're going to import material, and I'm just going to paste what I've copied. Now, instead of having a text here, I want a button for now, which is going to be our login button. So this is going to be a text button. On pressed, we're going to do something. We don't know what yet. We're not there. And the child is simply going to be the text login. A few commas at the end to format everything. It's complaining, this red is complaining you can't be a const if we've got a function in there. So we'll just take the const out of the scaffold and our autosave will put it in for us there. So that's it. We've got those two pages and we can make use of those later on. Next stage is we want to make an authentication repository. So in our repository folder, we're going to create a new file called authentication.dart. And this, of course, is going to be a class called authentication repository, like so. Okay. Now, what's this going to do? Well, this is going to be the bit where it's responsible for logging in and logging out our users, and as such we're going to need to handle that. Now for this to be efficient, we're going to have to hold some stuff in memory, and we really shouldn't be doing that in a repository. So I'm going to make a new folder in our libs called utils. In that folder we're going to create a new file, and we're going to call this cache client.dart, and this is going to be a class called cache client, and we're going to have in here, let's spell cache right, in here we're going to have a map of cache objects. So final map string object, which we'll call our cache. Now, a map, if you recall, is just a key essentially, which is going to be a string key, and then the container with whatever it's got in it. So in this case, we're saying that what it could store is an object. Okay. So when our cache client is instantiated, in our initializer, we just want to set this to be an empty object. So it's going to be key object and empty, nothing in it. Okay, so when we start, this is blank. We then want to be able to write stuff to it. So void write, and we need to know what we want to write to it. And so we're going to have a type that extends object. So it's got to be a type of object. And we're going to require a key, and we're also going to require an object, which will be value of type T, whatever it's been sent in. And then very simply, we're going to set the cache at the key supplied to equal the object that's just been passed in. That's it. Then we need to read it. Okay, so this is going to return something of type whatever or null. I'll explain why that in a second. And this is going to be similar. It extends the object, and for reading we're going to require just the string because we need to know what the key is. Okay, so the final value is going to equal the object at that key, but we want to make sure that it is of the correct type. So we can then say if value is of type T, then we're going to return that value. Otherwise, we're going to return null. Okay, so if we're saying get out the object at this key and we expect it to be, I don't know, a conference repository, and it is not, then it's going to return null. And that's it, and we'll see how we use that in a little bit. So back to our authentication repository. In our authentication repository, we're going to need that. Okay, so we're going to have a final cache client, which we will call cache. And we're also going to need access to our Firebase authentication. So final Firebase auth, we've already imported that package, and we will call that Firebase auth. Okay, so let's set up our constructor for our authentication repository. We're going to want a cached client optionally sent in, which we'll call cache, and we're also going to want a Firebase auth sent in. However, in our initializer, we will say cache, our private cache, is going to equal the cache that was sent in, or if that's null, i.e. if they didn't send in a cache, we will instantiate our own here. Okay, and again, similarly, we'll do the same for Firebase auth. That's going to equal the Firebase auth that is sent in, and if that is null, we'll instantiate an instance, just an instance of that Firebase. So now our authentication repository has both the cache and the Firebase auth. what do we need to do? Well, first thing is we're going to want to be able to log in a user. So let's create a function which will return nothing. So it's going to be a future void login with email and password, because we might do other methods later. That's going to take in a couple of parameters. We are going to require a string, well, in fact, we're going to require curly braces. Let's put those in. Require string email, copy that, require string password. Because if we're logging in with a username and password, we need the username and password. This is going to be an async function, and we're just going to await Firebase auth sign in with email and password, and we will send that the email and password, and then I'll come and correct the spelling of password like that. Fantastic. Now that might throw an error. So if, for example, the password is wrong or the email is not formatted correctly or something like that, Firebase auth will throw us an error. So we need to deal with that. So we'll do that in a try catch. Okay, and we're going to, they throw a specific error. It's a Firebase auth exception. So we will say on Firebase auth exception catch E, in fact I don't need to catch that side, catch E, that's our error. And if another error appears which isn't a Firebase auth exception, then we will also want to catch that, and we will also rethrow an error. Now we want to throw an error that our program can understand and deal with, because the number of errors that Firebase could throw is extensive. So let's come right up to the top, just outside of our class, and here we will create a new class called login with email and password failure, which implements an exception. So this becomes an exception itself. Okay, and this will have a final string message, which will be the error message we throw to our users. Okay, so let's set up a constructor, and in the constructor we're going to set this.message equals an unknown error has occurred. Okay, that's what's going to throw if we don't know. So by default that's what's going to happen. However, Firebase auth is going to send us a code back, and we can utilize that code to try and give our users a better error message. So if we don't recognize the code, that's what we will throw. Otherwise, we'll create a factory for the login and email password failure, and we'll say from code, and this will pass in a code. And then we will switch that code and do something. Well, what are we going to do? Well, by default, if we don't recognize the code, or if it's not in if we're not programming it in now, we're going to return a login with email and password failure. So by default, even if we don't know what the code is, we're just going to throw this error message. However, if we do know what the code is, we can give it a better thing. And all these codes are available on the Firebase Authentication documentation. And there's quite a few of them, but we're only worried about some. One of the codes is invalid email. And you can guess what that does. that happens when a user's typed in an email that's not valid. And so hopefully we won't see that, because maybe we should be checking the email address before we send it to Firebase. But we'll deal with that one when we come to that. So this is going to throw a login and email password failure. And here we'll put in a new error message. Email address is not valid. Okay, so we've got our custom error message. I'm then going to copy those lines. Copy. And we're going to paste it in. Next one is going to be user disabled. And here we can put this user has been disabled. And because it's for a particular app, it's a conference, we can put a better error. Please contact the conference organizers. Okay. Next one is going to be user not found. And we will put in here email address not registered. That'll do. And then the final one we're going to handle, which without a default error message, is going to be wrong password. And we'll just say incorrect password. Alright, so that's it. So coming back down here, when we have a Firebase exception, it's taken out a bit of code that I put in. That's the auto formatting for you. We're going to catch that error and we'll rethrow it, but we'll throw our login and email password failure with code, and the code we will get from the error that Firebase auth exception provides us. Otherwise, we will just throw, and this is a constant, a login and password failure, and that will be our default error message. Okay, that's our login function taken care of. Once we've logged in, we're going to want a way to log out. So we're going to create another future void here called logout. This is also going to be an async function. And this is a lot simpler. We're just going to await Firebase auth sign out. And that's it. Okay. So that's us logging in and logging out. Now, what do we want to do? Well, we need to be able to watch the user. Later on, we're going to need to keep an eye and watch when a user changes. So I'm going to do that above our login of email and password. And here we're going to have a stream which is going to return an app user. We don't have an app user, but we will do in a minute. We'll call this get user. And that's going to return some stuff. In fact, we should come and create that user now. So over in our models directory, we've already got a user profile, but that's for our profile. It's not the user of the app necessarily. It might be a profile of another user that our app user is looking at. So let's create a new file here, and we will call this app user.dart. And we don't need too much in here. It's going to be a class called app user. It is going to extend equatable, so that way we can compare it later on in one of our states. We need a constructor for it, and we need to store some data. So for now, I only want to store 2 bits just while we get this set up. I want to store the user ID number, the unique user ID number, and I want to store their email address. And I want that to be optional. So in our constructor, we're going to require a user ID, and we're also going to allow them to save the email, but it's not going to be required. It's equatable, so we need to extend our props, and we've only got 2 of them, so we'll just pop those 2 in, and that's the basics. Couple of helper things now. I want to be able to create an empty user. So if our user is blank, it means they're not logged in. So I'm going to have a static const empty, which is just going to return an app user with a UID of blank. And then we can create 2 helper getters. We can say is empty, and that is going to return a boolean if this equals app user empty. And we're also going to have a not empty, and that's going to be if the user is not empty. And that's that. Okay, let's close that down. We can now import that app user into here, and we can now watch changes for that user or in Firebase. So whenever the auth state changes, we're going to do something. So we're going to return here our Firebase auth state changes map, because we don't want to return a Firebase user. Let's put that in. We don't want to return a Firebase user. We want to return our user. Okay, so it's not going to be an arrow function. We're going to do it as a block like this, and we're going to say final user equals Firebase user null. So is the Firebase user null? If it is, then we're going to return an app user dot empty. So if we're not logged in, or if we've logged out, Firebase is actually going to return null here. And if that's null, we want to convert that to our empty user. Otherwise, we want to convert our Firebase user to an app user. Now that doesn't exist yet. We can't do that. How do we do that? Well, we're going to create an extension. Even though we didn't write the Firebase user, we can add to it by creating an extension on user. And this user here is a user, a Firebase user. You can see it's from the Firebase auth. So on a Firebase auth user, we're going to create a new getter that returns our app user called toAppUser. And that is going to return an app user where the UID equals the UID, because there is a UID on app user, and an email returns an email. Okay, so a Firebase user has a UID and it has an email, or optionally it has an email. And so we're going to return those and convert that into an app user. So our user here is going to equal Firebase user or an empty, depending on whether a null is returned or not. And then we're going to return that user. Okay. But at this stage, I also want to store that user in memory so we can access it later. So to do that, we need to create a key that we're going to use for our cache. And just so that it's consistent throughout our app, I'm going to call it user cache key, and we'll put something here. It doesn't really matter what this is. User cache key, like that. So once we have our user, before we return it, we're going to say cache write in the user cache key the value user and comma. So whenever our auth user changes, or the auth state changes, we get the current user, it's saved in cache, and it's converted to our user. Finally, I'm going to create a function in here that returns an app user called get current user. It's getter current user, and this is going to return our cache read, and the key is going to be user cache key. And now, if you remember this, when we set this up, we set it up to expect a type, and so we're going to say here we expect this to be an app user, and if this returns a null, then we're just going to return an app user empty. So when we call current user on our authentication repository, it will quickly look up in the memory, the cache, to see whether we have a user, and if we have, it'll return it, otherwise it'll return an empty user. Okay, that is our authentication repository done. Okay, next we want to create an authentication block. We're going to do that in our global blocks folder. At the moment we've just got our connectivity one. So on the blocks folder, I'm going to right click and go to a new block, and we'll simply call this auth. This is going to be our auth block. That will create a folder called block. Just going to rename that to auth, just to make things stand out a bit, and we have our auth block files ready to go. Alright, let's start with the state, and we're going to do a little bit of changes in here. First of all, we're going to have an enum, which is going to be our auth status, and there's going to be two statuses: authenticated and unauthenticated, and that will do for that. Next, our auth state isn't going to be an abstract, it's just going to be a normal class that extends a quotable, but it's going to be in a private constructor, i.e. I don't want to be able to create it directly. It is going to require a status, which we'll call status, and it's also going to require a user, except it's not going to require, if it hasn't got a user, it's going to give us an app user.empty. Okay, so we need to store those, of course, so we've got a final auth status, state us, got to be careful here with state and status, auth status, which we'll call status. Let's put a comma in there to keep it all in one line, and a final app user called user. So with this being private, we need some way of instructing that. So we're going to create an auth state authenticated, which is going to take in an app user called user, and then in our initializer we're going to say that this status, and so if we're here, if we're authenticated, it's going to be auth status authenticated, and the user is going to be the user we've just passed in. Save that. Okay. And similarly, we need an unauthenticated one. So const auth state unauthenticated. That doesn't take a user, but it does have an initializer. And the initializer is going to be this dot private constructor, and the status is going to be auth status unauthenticated. Finally, in our props, we need to override both of those. So we're going to override the status, and we're going to override the, well, sorry, we're not overriding them, we're overriding the props to say, look at the status and look at the user, and if those are different, then our status has changed. And then we don't need this auth initial, we'll get rid of that. Okay, that is all we need for our state. We're going to have some events though, and the first event we're going to have is a class called auth user changed, and that's going to extend an auth event. That is going to have a final app user, because if we're changing we need to know what the user is, and the constructor is going to be auth user changed, and it's going to require a user. Again, we need to override the props, and there's only one prop here, it's the user, and that's it. We're also going to have another event, which is logout. So auth request logout extends auth event. And we could do login here as well, but I'm not going to for now because, well, essentially login is only going to ever happen in one place. You can only log in from the login page. However, you might be able to log out from a number of different pages. Let's come to our auth block now. So we've got our constructor. What are we going to need in here? Well, we're going to definitely need our authentication repository, which we will call authentication repository. We're also going to need a late final stream subscription, which is going to give us an app user, which is the user subscription. And this will be the stream of user changes. We'll come to that in a second. Okay, given those, we need to set them up. So in our constructor of our auth block, we're going to require an authentication repository, which we will call authentication repository. And in our initializer, we will say that our private authentication repository is going to equal the authentication repository we've just passed in. Okay. Now, what about our initial state here? This is where we have to set our initial state. In fact, I'm just going to get rid of this because we don't need that at the moment. What's our initial state? Well, it depends whether we're logged in or not. So our initial state is going to be this. We're going to say the authentication repository that we've just passed in. We're going to get the current user, and if it is not empty, then the initial state is going to be auth state authenticated, and the user is going to be the authentication repository current user. Remember, that's the thing we've saved in memory. Otherwise, if the current user is empty, then it's going to be auth state unauthenticated, like so. So as soon as the soup is called, we're going to see whether we've got a user. If we have got a user, then our initial state for this block is going to be authenticated with that user. Otherwise, it's going to be unauthenticated. Right. We do need a constructor body though, because we do need to look at our events that might be called. So the two events we've got are on auth user changed, and when that happens, we're going to call a method on user changed, and we can control dot to create that method. And then the other one we've got is auth logout or request logout, and we will just say here logout, and again we will create that method just like that. Okay, finally within our constructor we need to set up this stream because we need to watch to see when our user changes. So we're going to say user subscription equals our authentication repository user. We're going to listen to that, and we're going to be getting back a user. So if we get a user back, we're going to add an event auth user changed, and we're going to pass the user to that event, and that will fire this down here, which currently does nothing, but it will do. Okay, so that's our user subscription set up. However, we need to make sure we close that. So we need to override the close method, and we're just going to say here user subscription cancel. Okay, so when this block is closed down, it's going to cancel the user subscription and then close itself down. All right, we're doing good here. Now we just need to code these two parts. So what happens when the user is changed? Well, in that case, we're going to emit a new state. And just like we did at the top, we're going to say if the event user is empty, then we're going to return an auth state unauthenticated. Otherwise, no comma there. Otherwise, we're going to return an auth state authenticated with the user, which we get from the event. And that's it. For our logout, it's a lot simpler. We're going to call unawaited, and that basically ignores the future, just does it straight away. It's not going to wait around for the future, it's going to call it. And the future we're going to call is the authentication repository or logout. We don't need to wait for it, we don't need to pause the code here, it's going to do that. The actual logout is going to be handled when the user changes, because we will see that we're listening for the user to change. We'll get a null user back here, or in the repository, which will convert it to an empty user. It'll then call the user changed and call everything to close us down. Okay, that is our auth block taken care of. Now we've just got to put all this together. Okay, I'm going to close all this down because most of this now hopefully is going to happen in the main.dart. So what do we have going on here? Well, we have our my app being called, and in here we're going to need to get access to our authentication repository. So let's call that in like so, and like the database, that is going to be required. So we will require this authentication repository, which means we're going to have to pass it in up here. So our authentication repository is going to equal an instance of our authentication repository. Excellent. So we've got that. We now need to provide it. And to do that, we're going to provide it here with a repository provider value, and the value is just the authentication repository. That's just a shorthand of doing this, really. We could do the same here. I don't know why I haven't, but we haven't. Okay, so that's our authentication repository provided. We now then need to provide it the authentication block to the rest of our thing. So we need to change this block provider here into a multi-block provider. And here we're going to provide the auth block. Now the auth block requires an authentication repository, and we can just pass in the authentication repository that we've got, and it's the same instance because it's all being passed through. Okay, now we've got that authentication repository, we need to actually have a builder that listens to it. So I'm going to wrap our material app with a block listener. Now I've got lots of red here because of consts. We'll just take the consts out, and it's going to complain there's not a const there. It doesn't matter. Now a block listener is like a block builder, except it only listens for changes and implements code rather than widget changes. You'll see now. So what we're looking for here is the auth block, and we expect to see an auth state. Okay, and then we will implement the listener in a second. Next, in our material app, we need to start setting up our routing, and I'm going to do that here for now. We'll move this out to another file later on, but we can list all our routes here. So our initial route is going to be our splash screen, and I tell you what I haven't done, which I will do now, is in our screens folder we've got a barrel file, and we're not making use of that, so I'm just going to export all the files, all the screens here. So what we've got the splash screen, and we've also got the sign-in screen. Okay, that just means we're only having one import here rather than 4. So we're going to import the splash screen, and it's going to complain that that can't be a const now, so we'll take that out. Okay, the other screens we're going to have are a login screen. No surprise, that's going to be the login screen, or did I call it sign in? So I call it sign in screen. Okay, and then we've got our home screen, which is going to be the home screen that we're currently using. And then we're going to take out the home, but we are going to set an initial route to be that. Now by default it will take slash as the initial route anyway, but just putting that there means we can change this while we're developing to take us straight to a page. Okay, let's build the app at this point. It won't work quite yet, but let's build it and make sure we've not done something really stupid. So just give me a second while it builds. Okay, well the code's built and we've got our splash screen. So it does seem that things are okay at the moment. let's take this the next stage further. So now within our listener here for our auth block, we want to see what state our authentication is in. So we're going to say if state is auth status authenticated, we're going to do something, else we're going to do something else. Well, we want to navigate, and that's what we want to do. We want to navigate to different pages, but the navigator doesn't happen until the material app is built. So at the moment we haven't got access to the navigator here, but we can give ourselves access to it. We can do that by coming up to within the My App and giving ourselves access to the navigator state by saying final global key navigator state, and we'll call this nav key equals a global key of type navigator state. And then within our navigator or our material app, we can say our navigator key is the nav key. Now by default, the material app will create a navigator key for us, but we can't access it. But doing it like this means we can access it. So now up here, we can say navigator key current state, current context, current state dot pushed replacement named and the route we want to go. Well, if we're authenticated, we want to go to our home. And this is complaining because the current state might be null, but we know it's not because we've set it up. So we'll say we know. Just copy that line and paste it here. And if we're not authenticated, then we're going to go to the login page. We need to add status there because we've got the state, but it's the status we're checking. Okay, let's save that and refresh. And we've got an error. Dart line 32. It can't be a const, yeah, because we're now setting up global state in here. So let's save again and do a hard refresh. And we're logged in. Okay. Now, how do we log out? Well, we have no way of logging out currently. What happens if we come to our profile page? Well, that still works, so that's good. So let's create a logout button on here for now. So come back to our profile page, and where we have this image, in the last episode we put this icon button in for editing the photo. So we're not worried about that, but underneath that we're going to be putting a positioned, and there we're going to put another icon button, and the icon is going to be icons dot is it logout or sign out? Logout. That will do. Logout. And it's going to have an onPressed function, and that can be a const. That's what it's complaining about there. Yeah, okay, so that's there. The icon can have a colors.white. I'm not saying I'm leaving this here as part of the design, it's just really going for testing at the moment. We might move it. Where do we want it? Well, we want it 10 up from the bottom and 10 in from the right. I'll just chuck it down there. Okay, so there's an icon button. what happens when we click it? Well, when we press it, we want to context read our auth block and add an auth request logout event. So let's save that and let's hit the button and we're logged out. Now our login button should log us in, but of course we haven't programmed it. So let's come to our login page here, and in here we're going to say context read. We really should be doing this with the block, but I'm going to stick with what I'm doing at the moment. It's the authentication repository here. It's not really maintaining any state, but we do need to insert Flutter block, and we should have here a login with email and password. Okay, and then we just use the login that we've got for now, which is drag@test.com, and the password was password 123. So that should log us in. Let's click the login button and we're logged in. Excellent. So now we have the problem. We've got this back arrow up here and we don't always want that to appear. In fact, if we click it, it's going to come back to itself. It's just the way the navigator works. There's a few ways around fixing that, but since this page will never have a back arrow because it's the home page, the simplest way of dealing with that is to disable the back arrow. So we can do that with and just to show you it doesn't matter, it only really matters for the time that people log in. If we refresh this like so, then the arrow's disappeared anyway. It's not an issue. So let's come to our home page. In the app bar, we can set automatically imply leading to false and save that. So now when we log out and we log back in again, we haven't got that issue. So there we are, we have our authentication sorted out. We of course need to work on how our login page looks and actually allow users to be able to type in their username and password, but we'll deal with that next time. For now folks, if you've enjoyed, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, it does help me out, and we'll see you next time. Take care now, bye.